Well, here in Australia, we have some wonderful politicians and in particular some wonderful senators that are pursuing the truth when it comes to COVID, when it comes to excess deaths, when it comes to the cause of why we would be seeing a spike in excess deaths. But Australia is not the only country where that is happening, and we had some very interesting news come out of the UK on that front. I'm joined now by Dr Melissa McCann to discuss this news. Dr McCann, thank you so much for joining us.
Hi, Topher. Thanks for asking me on.
Well, very happy to have you. Now, this is the headline here. The Health Secretary, this is the UK, of course, Health Secretary, urged to release data that, quote, may link COVID vaccine to excess deaths. There seems to be a reality that this issue is not going to go away. There are certainly people that have been hoping that it would, but Dr. McCann, it seems like it's not.
Yeah, I'm really pleased to see that it's not. And I'm not surprised by that, Topher, because I've spoken to so many people who've lost their loved ones, and these people are not giving up on their fight for the truth to come out and a fight for further investigation as to what happened to their loved ones. So I'm not surprised there's ongoing pressure. There's pressure from a number of politicians in Australia as well. I think it's really pleasing to see this progress in the UK.
Yeah, it is good to see. And of course, what they're trying to get answers to is this graph here. There are a couple of different ways of modelling excess deaths, and we see two slightly different coloured lines there showing the different ways of modelling that. But in either case, there is a clear signal here. Some people might argue that it's due to COVID. Some people might argue that it's due to other policies and nothing to do with vaccines. But one thing that seems very clear to me is this is data that demands an answer. And to date, correct me if I'm wrong, but there seems to have been a pretty powerful lack of curiosity here in Australia, the UK, Canada, and other parts of the world about what might be causing something like this.
Well, certainly a lack of explanation for it, Topher, and even if there is some curiosity, no impetus to look further. The actuaries have published a number of reports on what might be the cause of death and or causing this spike in excess deaths. And there's no real satisfactory explanation for that at the end of each of their reports. And for such a number of, we're talking tens of thousands of people in numbers of excess deaths. I mean, that's just such a historic, never seen before and really alarming signal. And yeah, I agree. I don't understand why this isn't just ringing alarm bells everywhere.
Yeah, well, you say tens of thousands of people, that's just in Australia, and then tens of thousands again in each other country, and running into the hundreds of thousands in many countries of unexplained excess deaths that we don't know what's going on. Now, I want to dive into the report a little bit deeper here because this is really quite significant. This isn't just a single fringe MP that has gone and lobbed some questions and gotten some headlines. I'll read directly from the report. A cross-party group has written to Victoria Atkins to sound the alarm about the growing public and professional concerns. And that's encouraging to me as well, Melissa, that this is no longer being viewed as some fringe conspiracy theory, that there are actual professional concerns now at the UK's rate of excess deaths since 2020. Ministers, that being UK government ministers, have blamed the rise in excess deaths on record NHS waiting lists and the pandemic backlog, but the parliamentarians are demanding to be shown the underlying data to support the government's assertion that there is, quote, no evidence linking excess deaths to the vaccine for COVID-19. And I quote again, if these data do indeed exist, please share them. If thorough investigations have already ruled out such a link, please share the relevant reports, their letter says. There is no place here for blind faith. Given what we've been through since early 2020, do you agree with this assertion that there is no place for blind faith on this topic?
Absolutely, Topher. We're talking about the lives cut short, and we're talking about a large number of people who've died and that are leading to these excess death numbers, as you say, around the world. I think there's sufficient distrust in public authority now as a consequence of the various issues that could be described as mishandling of the COVID pandemic. As a consequence of that, the public does not have blind faith in the medical authorities. If the data is there and it's available, there's no explanation as to why that's not been released.
It seems quite extraordinary. I mean, we saw a leaking in New Zealand where someone who had access to the data then leaked that data, and that's caused an enormous controversy over there. That's not what we're about today. But it seems that we as taxpayers are funding research and funding data and funding these reports that we then never get to see. That doesn't seem like a particularly democratic situation, but we don't get to see them, but other people do. I'll continue reading from this report. There's a group of 21 MPs and Peers from 4 parties parties that have authored this letter. And jumping to that middle paragraph there, they believe potentially critical data which maps the date of people's COVID vaccine doses to the date of their death have been released to pharmaceutical companies, but not into the public domain. Now that seems quite extraordinary, Mal, that we're seeing privileged access to this data for the very companies that might have caused the very excess deaths that are being looked into.
Yeah, that's an extraordinary statement. They do say we believe, so I guess that's clarifying the fact that the authors or the MPs apparently don't have, perhaps first-hand knowledge or proof of that. If that's true, though, Topher, I mean, two huge questions. First of all, why on earth release that data to pharmaceutical companies if there's allegedly no correlation at all with vaccination? It's irrelevant then to the pharmaceutical companies. The second issue is that if that is the case, and let's say, as they're suggesting, that there is no link with vaccines, then this data would definitively prove that. And if you look at the tanking share prices and phenomenally low vaccine uptake, these companies have an obligation to their shareholders or risk, civil claims against them if they don't release data that would potentially improve those share prices by demonstrating that the vaccines are not the cause for this. So perhaps they don't have that data. If they do, that raises some really serious questions.
Certainly does, and it's very encouraging to see this coming from the very highest levels of the UK parliamentary system and political system. Yourself, Dr McCann, you're pressing ahead with a very, very important, potentially landmark court case here in Australia. So let's bring the conversation back home a little bit. Many people have been following your story. Many people are waiting with interest, and of course, many people are involved in the court case that you're running. Tell us a little bit about the case and where it's up to.
Yeah, well, the case is a federal civil class action, so it's seeking compensation. It's seeking that on the behalf of the vaccine injured and bereaved. And the respondents in this case is the TGA, the Health Department, and the various actors within those departments. And what it's alleging is that negligence or misfeasance in the actions of those authorities to approve the vaccines based on the information that was available to them, and various other actions in regards to statements which we allege were misleading to the Australian public in terms of assurances of the safety and efficacy of the vaccine. So that's the case, and that's what's being alleged as part of the case. Where it's at now, we've had I won't say exactly how many, but let's just say quite a number of hundreds of people that have joined, provided their medical information, provided an account of what's happened to them, and joined the class action. And the stage that it's at now is that our first case management hearing is tabled for the 12th of April, and that will be in Sydney in the federal court. And that'll be really our first sort of face-to-face hearing in the early case management stages, which is where we're at now.
Well, one of the tricky things, of course, is that the pharmaceutical companies themselves have been given indemnity by the federal government. Now, that hasn't been tested in court yet, to my knowledge, but it certainly makes it much more difficult to hold the developers of the vaccines themselves responsible. And we're probably years away from that being possible. And so I guess you're going after the people that you can actually legally kind of, access and try and hold accountable. Is there any possibility here of liability and accountability going to an individual level, or is it just going to be the TGA as an organisation or the government as an organisation using taxpayers' money to pay out compensation?
Look, the individuals have to be named themselves, and they are named as respondents. So that includes John Skerritt, Brandon Murphy, Greg Hunt, and others. And yes, it is the case that the indemnity is provided that no matter who this case, essentially in some ways, whether this case was made out against the manufacturers for sort of a products liability claim, or the case that we're alleging here, which is a misfeasance and negligence claim, in either case, ultimately, I suppose it is the Commonwealth is responsible for those costs. And I think quite reasonably so, the public was advised that there would be a compensation scheme so that these people who experience injuries and bereavements had every right to expect that their costs would be covered. And of course, the TGA, I presume, as part of this legal process, they may have or take the opportunity to, bring in their own allegations against the pharmaceutical companies if it is the case that they've been provided with any false or misrepresentations by the companies themselves. perhaps that's an avenue for them, but certainly what our case makes out is that, in fact, an enormous body of information was provided by the company sponsors, was made available to the TGA, and that in all the circumstances, in reviewing all of the information they had available to them, that it was unreasonable and what we allege is negligent in terms of making those approvals, regardless of all the data that was provided to them. It was just a few months into the program where the periodic safety update reports, for example, were provided to the TGA. And this showed over 1,000 deaths. This showed cases of strokes, heart attacks. This was all provided very early on and before the widespread vaccination uptake within Australia. So really our allegation is against those parties who were responsible for that approval and for the post-marketing monitoring, and that the public quite rightly expected that should have been done to a very competent and high standard. We are talking about the health and lives of the Australian public.
Yeah, and certainly that as new data comes in, those recommendations should have been reviewed in light of that new data. And of course, we need court cases like yours to determine whether that was actually done appropriately. Well, Dr. Melissa McCann, I wish strength to your arm. I thank you for what you're doing. This sort of a thing is a very long road, and I know that you knew that going into it. It's there's no Hollywood endings in real life, unfortunately. It is just a case of being willing to stick it out and fight the good fight. So thank you for doing that on behalf of so many Australians, and I do wish you all the very best. We'll stay across this story here at the Aussie Wire, and as there are updates, we'll have Dr. Melissa McCann back. But for now, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Topher. Take care.